Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching. My name is Flalat from Africa, and we are still continuing with our challenge for supporting our own content creator, especially those who pays in this country. I'm in Kenya, and our challenge still continue for 29 days. Right now is 7, and I want to just go and wash my face, get a cup of tea as we edit there. Right? See you there. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe also to my YouTube channel. Subscribe, like, comment, give it a thumbs up so that YouTube algorithm could recognize me. So guys, let's edit there. Do our challenge as we normally do. So this challenge will call for 29 for 30 days, and today is day 29. We just need to record and bake any random content creator as we just told yesterday. See you there. Let's go. Guys, I'm ready brushing my teeth as we edit to our side. Guys, I'm done brushing my teeth. Let's go. Let's go, man. So, guys, I'm done brushing my teeth. I now want to wash my face as I get a cup of tea as we edit to a site or where we do our challenge. So guys, enjoy, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and give it even a thumbs up so that YouTube algorithm could give me or recommend me my video to other users. So guys, I love you all. Enjoy the video. Let's go support our own content creators in Africa, especially those who pays in this country. So today is Andrew Kibe, guys. I know you know that guy. Guys, anytime I wake up, I used to take a cup of water before I take a cup of tea. So that's my routine. I don't know your routine, but me, every day, I must take a cup of water before I take tea. That's my routine. So as you can see, I'm taking a cup of water before I take tea so that we can eat to our side. So guys, please enjoy. Today is Andrew Kibe. We can do it. Guys, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you're watching, my name is Lalat, and today is day 29 of our challenge. So we have picked a random guy, and this guy, I hope you know him, right? He's called Andrew Kibe. Andrew Kibe is based in another state, and he has 273 subscribers right now. So let's continue subscribing to his channel. Let's reach him 300. Let's go with our challenge, right? Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. 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 Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Let's reach him 300 subscribers. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Let's support our own. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. 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 Subscribe. Hi, girl. Say hi to YouTube. Kyle, can you say hi to YouTube? All right, let's go. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe. Even though there is a cow over here. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew. Tell people to subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Let's tell people to subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Talk to YouTube. Kyle, where are you going? Say hi to YouTube. Say hi to YouTube. Let's go. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. We must use the other route because we don't want to disturb the cow. Let's continue with our challenge. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Say hi to Andrew Kibe. Say hi. Hi, cute cow. How you doing? Say hi to YouTube. Tell people to subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Can you please tell them? Hi, girl. Tell people to subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Let's still continue with our challenge. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe. Let's go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe. Go subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Go and subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. 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 Oh, my hand is so dark, man. But we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it, man. There's no doubt on it. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. 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 Subscribe. Let's reach him 300. Subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. 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 Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. 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 Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe. Let's reach him 300 subscribers. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe. Go and subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. 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 Go and subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Go and subscribe. Go and subscribe to Andrew Kibe's channel. Thank you guys. I love you all. This is where we're gonna end our video today on day 29 of our challenge. I love you all, including everybody. Bye for now. See you in the next video. Bye.